On the eve of Princess Diana's funeral, the royal family is returning to London, hoping in perhaps to quell some of the criticism of their actions since Diana's death.
The world was grieving. The flowers piled high. The cameras rolled nonstop. And yet, for 7 days, the Queen stayed silent. After Princess Diana's shocking death, Britain demanded a response, but got nothing. Why? Was it a royal scandal in the making, a cold-hearted decision, or a hidden truth buried deep inside the palace? What really happened during those 7 silent days? The answer might just change the way you see the Queen forever. When everyone in the country was openly sad, the monarch's silence seemed out of place. Some saw it as a lack of understanding. Some people thought she had to have a reason for being quiet. But it stood out more the longer there was quiet. The house didn't say anything for 7 days. People had always seen the Queen as a sign of security, but she was never seen or heard. A lot of people thought she would lead the country in grief. In order to get away from the growing crowds in London, she stayed at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Soon, this lack of action became one of the most talked about parts of the tragedy. The news hosts started talking about it directly. Radio hosts who used to respect the royalty began to wonder why the Queen wasn't speaking out on air. Callers poured into stations to vent their anger, and the mood was mirrored in the newspaper headlines. "Where is our Queen?" one asked. "It's so quiet it hurts," read another. People were going from being sad to being suspicious and even angry in some cases. There were people who thought the royal family had lost touch with the people they were supposed to serve. Every day, the scene outside of Buckingham Palace got more sad. There were flowers on the ground. Some people cried quietly, while others stood still and looked up at the balcony of the palace, hoping that someone, anyone, would come out and say something about what the country was going through. As time went on, homemade signs began to show up among the lights and flowers. They were more than just honors to Diana. Some of them were right to the Queen herself. One said, "Talk to us, ma'am," and another said, "We need to hear from you." These weren't angry notes. They were pleas. People needed to be led, or at least feel like someone in charge understood how sad they were. There was doubt even among people who generally supported the monarchy. That week, polls showed that support for the royal family dropped by a large amount. People freely asked why the monarchy was important for the first time in a long time. People interviewed on the street said they felt like they were left behind. They didn't just want an official answer, they wanted one from a real person. At the time, the personal connection many people had with Diana made the silence harder to understand. People had always thought of her as the people's princess because she was kind, caring, and open. She shook hands with people who had AIDS when not many others would. She gave hugs to kids. She cried in public. She was seen as a person, not just a princess. On the other hand, the Queen's usual reserve felt cold and even old-fashioned. People who didn't understand what was going on sent a lot of messages to public organizations, like the BBC and town councils. People wrote messages to the editors of major newspapers across the country. Some people asked the Queen if she cared. Others asked for an answer. It wasn't politics that caused this rising feeling of disappointment. It had to do with feelings. At the same time, experts and hosts in the media started to make public guesses. Was the Queen not speaking because it's the right thing to do? Was she lying to you? Was there something more complicated going on behind the scenes? There was more pressure on Buckingham Palace. The whole country felt like time was running out. People thought that the Queen could no longer stay silent, and that if she didn't speak out soon, the damage to the throne could last for a long time. The Queen stayed at Balmoral the whole time. It's clear now that this was a time when custom and change were really at odds with each other. The royal family had long followed a set of rules that said they valued privacy, respect, and reserve over showing how they felt. She was taught that being quiet was a sign of power, and that she should always be calm in public. People thought there would be more, though. People wanted the truth. They wanted to feel things. And the Queen's normal way of doing things didn't seem to work for the first time in her reign. As the days went by, the quiet left a hole that was quickly filled with anger and guesswork. A while ago, the royal family was thought to be steady and trustworthy. Now they were being called distant, out of touch, and even uncaring. This was no longer just a sad story about one person. It had turned into a national emergency. The country was waiting for a comment, but the royal family didn't say anything. Not a single press meeting took place. No real-time news was sent out. Palace communications were mostly about making plans for the funeral, but they didn't say anything about how the country was feeling. No one said why the Queen hadn't come back to London. No one told the people that the monarchy knew how much pain they were in. At this point, the country didn't feel like it had a boss. Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister at the time, tried to fill the void by going on public events and giving a carefully crafted speech in which he called Diana the People's Princess. His words touched many people, but even he couldn't stop the rising sense that the Queen's silence was hurting things in the long run. What began as a time of grief was slowly becoming a time of national doubt. Many people thought that the Queen's absence meant something more important. It brought up questions that had been talked about behind closed doors for years. Did the government still talk to the people it ruled? Could it change over time? Could it still be useful in a world that wants people to be open and caring? The events of that week showed a crack in the long-standing bond between the British people and their government. And while the Queen's choice to keep quiet had good reasons that we now understand better, many people thought it was a mistake at the time. One thing would be enough to start fixing that break. This showed that the Queen had heard what the people had to say. This was a time to tell the country that she was more than just a queen. She was also a mother and a grandmother. Behind closed doors, the Queen was trying to do something she doesn't get to do very often. It was her goal to become a grandmother. The youngest of the royal children, William, was only 15 years old. Their mother had died quickly, violently, and in public. Their lives were forever changed in an instant. Millions of people around the world were watching them at the same time. Photographers set up camp outside of Balmoral. Every move they made was covered by the news. Their story was told around the world, even though they didn't want to be a part of it. At the time, not many people outside the family understood the Queen's choice. She would not go back to London right away. She would stay with her grandchildren instead. There would be no interviews, statements, or public performances for the press. During those early, very important days, she decided to keep William and Harry away from the chaos and close attention going on outside. There was a quiet sadness in the air at Balmoral. People shared meals. People whispered as they talked about memories. The Queen, who is known for being stiff and duty-bound, took on a more private role and helped the boys find some small sense of order during a week when nothing felt normal. Later, people who worked for the royal family said that the Queen thought her job as a grandmother could not wait, but her presence in London could. Her choice wasn't based on disregard, it was based on safety. She knew that the boys would have to deal with a public loss for the rest of their lives. During those 7 days, she tried to give them time to grieve without the stress of a public celebration. But outside, the stress kept building up. The country was still not ready. Emotional pleas were printed in newspapers. Broadcasters freely asked why the Queen wasn't there. Every day, the flower mountain outside of Buckingham Palace got bigger. From a mild state of confusion, things were now turning into general anger. Some of the Queen's advisors started to feel worried. The silence could no longer last. Talks took place behind closed doors. Should the Queen say something? Does she need to go back to London? People didn't agree. Some told her to keep going, while others were afraid that the monarchy's reputation would be harmed for good. It got so bad that Prime Minister Tony Blair got involved. He is said to have talked to the palace and strongly urged a more public reaction. Blair had been out and seen how people felt on the streets. He was aware that if the Queen didn't do something, the people might lose faith in the government forever. The Queen stayed firm even though the heat was building. She didn't act right away. From her point of view, it wasn't about how things looked or how they would affect the people. It had to do with what she thought was right. She had always felt a sense of duty, and to her, that duty meant taking care of her family when they were sick or hurt. Even so, The worries from other places were getting louder every day. There were rumors. Some people wondered if the Queen didn't care about other people. Some people thought she might be mad at Diana, or that old feelings were showing in her reaction. Even though none of these ideas were ever proven, people made them up because there wasn't enough clear communication. The Queen went back to London on the 7th day. It was a quiet but important moment. She rarely went outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, but this time she did. She took a long look at all the gifts that people had left. There were flowers on the ground. Letters, candles, and photos had been carefully placed by people who were sad. When she got there, some things were still being added. There were a few people nearby who stood still and watched her. She did not talk. She did not do anything fancy. But she looked at everything. The notes from kids, the photos of Diana, the words, and the tokens of love. She walked slowly along the fence as she took her time. The event was caught on camera and shown all over the country. Many people who watched at home saw a sign for the first time that the Queen knew how sad the country was. The Queen did something that night that she had never done before in her rule. She spoke to the whole country live on TV. She was wearing black and standing alone in a neutral room inside Buckingham Palace. Her message was steady, calm, and well-written, but it was also about them. She started by saying, "What I say to you now as your Queen and as your grandmother, I say from the heart." She had nice things to say about Diana and called her a unique and talented person. It made her sad to know that so many people in the UK and around the world were sad. The most important thing she did was talk about her grandkids. She told them how proud she was of them and how well they were doing. There wasn't much to the speech. It wasn't too upsetting. There weren't any specifics in it. Still, it was enough. For many, it was an important moment. Once the Queen spoke, the void that had been created during the week of silence started to fill. The mood started to change in the days that followed. People slowly began to trust the government again. Newspapers that had written negative reviews of the Queen's speech now wrote positive reviews of them. People felt like the royal family was somehow a part of the public's sadness for the first time since Diana's death. With the help of conversations and papers, it became clear how hard that week had been inside the palace. This did not bother the Queen. The way she grieved was her own, and she had to make a tough choice. She had to put her family first, even though the world was expecting the country to show leadership. After many years, some royal staff would say that the Queen had always wanted to stay with William and Harry. She thought that people's feelings would calm down in time, but the boys were in pain right now and needed help right away. She hadn't ignored how sad the country was. She had just decided that her family needed her more than her country did at this point. Many people used to be against that choice, but now some people understand it better. As time went on, people began to understand how complicated the situation really was. The Queen was stuck between her duty and her humanity, between what the people expected of her and her own personal duty. In many ways, it was not possible to make that choice. She did something that not many people thought she would by the end of that week. She broke down the barriers of custom and spoke as a person, not just as a crown princess. She did this to tell people that even the most famous person in the world can be hurting inside. At that moment, people did not understand how nearly impossible it was for that speech to take place. People who worked in the government and the palace afterwards said that long, difficult conversations were going on in the background. Early on, Prime Minister Tony Blair and other important people on his team saw that the silence was becoming a big problem. They knew that the throne could be hurt for a long time if the Queen didn't do something. It's hard to rebuild trust once it's been lost. Blair later said that it was one of the most difficult times in his first few months as Prime Minister. He did not wish to work too hard, but he also knew that the people might never forgive the royal family if the Queen didn't do something. People tried to convince her behind closed doors that the country needed a grandmother as well as a monarch, someone who could feel the loss with them, even if only for a moment. It wasn't easy for Queen Elizabeth to decide to talk. Her reputation as a calm, consistent, and controlled person had been built up over many years. She had always thought that being a boss meant controlling your feelings and not showing them. This was the plan that every public appearance and speech had followed. She was now being told to change how she did things. She was asked to talk as a person, not just as queen. This was uncharted ground. There had never been a time like this for the government. Of course, there had been tragedies in the past, and people's responses to royal events had always been different. But the people of the country had never felt such a strong personal connection to a member of the royal family, and they had never been so adamant about being heard. To understand the Queen's doubt, it helps to know where she came from. While Elizabeth was growing up, she was taught that feelings should be kept inside and not shown. She had learned the importance of duty, discipline, and modesty from a very young age. King George VI, her father, was a quiet guy who never thought he would become king. When he did, he took the part very seriously, even though he had trouble with public speech and anxiety. He showed Elizabeth what a boss should be like by being calm, steady, and always in charge. During her rule, the Queen did things this way. Even when she was going through a hard time, like when her father died, or when her cousin Lord Mountbatten was killed, she kept her cool. She thought the crown should never change its mind. It has to be there all the time, no matter what. The Queen did what she thought was right when Diana died, and the whole world looked to her for an answer. She stayed out of sight because she thought her job was to keep things stable, not show feelings. At least at first, she didn't fully understand that the country had changed. It was no longer enough for people to follow custom. They wanted to meet. The Queen began to think about everything that had happened in the days after she got back to London. A different side of her started to show in a letter she wrote just 6 days after Diana's funeral. The letter was written to a friend and lady-in-waiting for a long time, Lady Henriette Abel Smith. It was meant to be kept secret and never shared with anyone else. But when it was finally made public, it gave a rare look into how the Queen really felt. "It really was awfully sad," she wrote. The next sentence, "She is a huge loss to the country," told us even more. What did she say about William and Harry? "They have been so brave, and I am so proud of them." Even though the letter was short, it had a very personal tone. Through her public mask, the Queen had been going through the same pain as everyone else, maybe even more so because she was close to the boys and felt responsible for them. She wrote at the end of the letter by hand, "Emotions are still so mixed up, but we have all been through a very bad experience." That last sentence stood out. In official letters, the Queen almost never talked about her feelings, so the words "a very bad experience" told us a lot. Plus, the exclamation point she added, which wasn't like her, made it even more clear how upset she was. This wasn't a well-thought-out public statement. It was a private letter of grief to someone she trusted that was meant to be kept secret. Experts in history and the royal family read this letter, and it helped them understand a lot of what had seemed strange that week. The Queen hadn't forgotten about the land. Protecting her family, keeping her cool, and avoiding what she saw as emotional reactions were all things she thought were right. That method didn't work this time, though. She knew it. As time went on, more proof came to light that the Queen had been going through a lot that week. Later, her former private secretary confirmed that she thought the choice to remain quiet was one of the hardest parts of her rule. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that she wasn't sure how to answer in a way that was in line with her beliefs. This was a big moment for the whole royal family, not just Queen Elizabeth. The institution had to look at how it interacted with the people again because of it. The events of that week showed that showing feeling, being open, and connecting with others were not signs of weakness. In fact, people now expect their leaders to have these traits. The Queen started to change. Not quickly, but clearly. Her public appearances became more about her. In her speeches, she started to talk about her feelings more openly. And the Office of Royal Relations started to become more up-to-date. More quickly, statements were made public. There were more responses to national tragedies. It was still a royalty, but it started to show more of its human side. In the years that followed, the Queen spoke at many events that made people feel very strongly, from the aftermath of terrorist acts to their own anniversaries. Even though she kept her cool, her tone became warmer and more approachable. It was not obvious, but it was important. The public may never know all of the Queen's private thoughts during that week in 1997, but the letter, the speech, and the personal stories that have come to light show a woman who was trying to balance the needs of her family and the needs of the country. It wasn't simple. It wasn't great. It was real, though. This change wasn't just for one person. There was a change in how the people felt about the government. An understanding that tradition wasn't enough and that current leadership needed more. The Queen never said sorry for taking so long to answer, but what she did in the years that followed said a lot. She paid attention. She knew now. She had changed too. Not only do people remember Diana, but they also remember the Queen because of that week. In public, it showed that even the most calm person can have questions, hurt, and make mistakes. But it also proved that even the most established institutions can change. Writings that the Queen kept to herself were one of the most telling bits of this puzzle. Some of her writings, including emails, diaries, and reflections, were shared by trusted staff members or included in official biographies, even though she never meant for them to be seen by the public. Together, they gave a fresh view. The silence wasn't because they were cold. It had been about being careful, and fear in many ways. People were afraid of making a mistake or showing emotion in a way that might not be proper for a monarch. She was also afraid of weakening the part she had spent her whole life upholding, which was based on poise, tradition, and careful words. But maybe the biggest fear was giving up the only way of leading she had ever known. She was afraid, but that didn't stop her from learning. Some changes were made by Queen Elizabeth after Diana's death, but they were not big or sudden. Instead, they were made slowly and carefully. She started to be more open and honest when she was in public. Her Christmas shows became more friendly. When there was a national disaster, like the London bombings in 2005 or the fire at Grenfell Tower in 2017, she spoke out quickly and clearly. She went to see victims and talked to survivors, and she showed that the crown could show both strength and feeling. This change was minor, but important. In addition to the Queen's personal approach, it showed a change in how the royal family talked to the people. It became more personal in the speeches that were written. Statements came out more quickly. It was clear that people tried to fit the mood of the country, and not just through rules and manners. Behind the scenes, the royal family changed how they talked to each other. The press offices were better at responding. The times of media appearances were better. Though the government kept its formality, it became more aware of how quickly public opinion could change. The terrible events of 1997 taught us a hard lesson. We could no longer hide behind silence. Not only did the Queen's change affect her public tasks, it also changed how she interacted with her family in public. As the years went by, there were more and more public family problems. Tensions rose when Prince Andrew was involved in scandals, when Prince Harry and Meghan stopped doing royal tasks, and when people's views on the future of the monarchy changed. People who watched each event said that the royal reaction, while still measured, was more affected by feelings and thoughts than it used to be. Some of these changes were caused by old people. The younger royals, especially William and Harry, were friendlier, more open, and more willing to let the public know how they really felt. But even the Queen, who was getting close to the end of her reign, was ready to change. She went to events that were about current issues. She backed efforts to improve mental health. Her grandchildren's emotional problems were talked about in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few decades ago. The shadow of 1997 stayed with us through it all. In her talks, the Queen never talked about that week by name. She never responded to the complaints in public. But people who knew her well said it would stay with them forever. It taught her how strong feelings can be and how important it is for leaders to be both strong and soft. It also reminded her that people were important, even in her official job. In the last few years of her life, the Queen's popularity stayed high. People liked her again, and in many ways they liked her even more. The steady, quiet person who had been through controversy, loss, and political change had come to stand for something deeper. Stability, not just in tradition, but in personal strength. Different things happened over time to cause that change. It was the end of a long process that began during a national emergency. The death of her ex-daughter-in-law, the grief of a country, and the threat of losing the public's trust were some of the hardest things the Queen had to deal with during her reign. But she found a way through it. But the memory of that quiet moment never went away. People who study history often call it a turning point, because it was then that the monarchy had to face its connection with the people in a new way. Before Diana died, there was a kind of mental distance between the royal family and the public. After that, that barrier was no longer okay. People wanted the truth. They wanted to meet. They were interested in whether or not people wearing crowns and medals could also feel sadness and doubt. That lesson stuck with the Queen. She allegedly thought about that week in 1997 a lot in private. In her notes and letters, she often wrote the simple phrase, "It was a very bad experience." These words came up over and over again in her private thoughts. Some people might think it's not enough, but to people who knew her well, it meant everything. The Queen didn't use strong emotional words very often. She didn't just put in exclamation points for no reason. When she did, it showed a lot. It was all there, hidden behind simple words, the stress, the sorrow, and the fear of letting people down. She had been taught her whole life to put job first, so the fact that she admitted something had been a very bad experience was pretty big. Not just her long rule, ceremonies, or awards, but also her ability to learn may be what people remember her for the most. She didn't give up on her beliefs. She didn't completely change who she was, but she did listen. She changed. She did this in a world that was changing quickly and kept the monarchy alive. That week in 1997 might have been the start of the end, but it turned out to be a lesson. A deep, private, and quiet lesson that helped shape the rest of her rule. The kingdom held on, but things never quite the same again. For many, the question, what if the Queen had spoken sooner, is still fresh in their minds. Would you remember that week in a different way? Would the anger have gone away faster? How hard would it have been to rebuild trust? There is no clear answer to those questions. It is clear that the Queen's quiet, which was taken the wrong way at the time, was not because she didn't care. It came from a place of custom, care, and a lot of personal pain. In the short term, it may have put the government farther away from the people, but in the long term, it led to a change that brought them closer. The Queen never said sorry in public in the end. She didn't have to. What she did spoke louder. She went through a lot of changes over the years, but the way she carried herself through them all said more than words ever could. She was more than just a queen. Great-grandmother. A woman who was formed in a different era is now learning how to live in a contemporary one. That's probably why, in the end, people were willing to forgive the silence.